By Christmas Eve 1914, the Western Front had become a frozen maze of trenches, mud, barbed wire, and exhausted soldiers waiting for a war they had been told would already be over.
Across Belgium and France, British, French, Belgian, and German soldiers faced each other from trenches so close that some enemies could hear coughs, jokes, and cooking.
The space between them was called no man's land, which is a bureaucratic way of naming a place everybody owned with fear and nobody wanted. December brought cold rain, frozen ground, soaked boots, lice, smoke, and the kind of misery that makes patriotism look for a dry pair of socks. Pope Benedict XV had asked Europe's leaders for a Christmas pause, but the official answer was basically no, because apparently even peace needed permission from people far away from the mud. The generals kept the war running, but the men in the trenches were living close enough to notice something dangerous. The enemy sounded human. On Christmas Eve, in some German lines, small fir trees and candles appeared along the parapets, glowing in the frost like tiny acts of disobedience. Then voices rose out of the dark, first German carols, then answers from British and Allied trenches, song crossing the killing ground before any soldier dared to. For men trained to listen for artillery, machine guns, and commands, hearing Silent Night drifting over mud must have felt like history briefly losing its script. Nobody knew whether it was a trick, because war had already taught suspicion faster than it taught geography. But in one sector after another, shouting replaced shooting, and rough English and German greetings began floating across the gap. Some Germans called out, "Merry Christmas." Some Allied soldiers called back, and the first brave men lifted their heads above trenches that usually punished curiosity. In places, signs appeared with the simple battlefield logic of "you do not shoot, we do not shoot," which may be the most sensible military policy ever written on cardboard. Slowly, cautiously, soldiers climbed into no man's land, hands visible, shoulders tight, waiting for the world to change its mind and start firing again. It did not. At least, not there. And the impossible became awkwardly practical. Enemies walked toward each other through frost, wire, mud, and silence. They shook hands with men they had been ordered to kill, and for a few minutes, nobody seemed to know where to put the hatred. Cigarettes changed hands, then chocolate, tobacco, buttons, hats, plum pudding tins, badges, and whatever small comforts soldiers had been hoarding against the cold. Some swapped addresses or showed photographs from home, because apparently the fastest way to complicate an enemy is to discover he has a mother. Men compared trenches, laughed nervously at each other's accents, and discovered that misery had been running a very international exchange program. In some accounts, a British soldier even found his pre-war German barber and got a haircut, because history occasionally pauses for absolutely unreasonable grooming. There were games, too, though the famous football match was probably less a clean stadium event and more a few chaotic kickabouts with whatever round object could survive the mud. Still, the image mattered. Soldiers in heavy coats chasing a ball between trenches, while the great machines of war waited like embarrassed furniture. The truce was not only laughter and cigarettes, because no man's land still held the cost of the months before. In several sectors, soldiers used the silence to recover and bury dead comrades who had been unreachable between the lines for weeks. Some burial services were shared, with men from both sides standing bareheaded in the cold, not as allies exactly, but as witnesses. That may have been the real heart of the truce. Not that war vanished, but that soldiers briefly admitted what it was doing to all of them. Historians still debate where it began or how it spread, but roughly 100,000 troops are believed to have taken part across sections of the front. It was never universal, and that matters because in many places the guns kept firing, and in some places attempts to fraternize ended in tragedy. French and Belgian soldiers often had less reason to trust the moment because German troops were occupying their homes, not some abstract patch of somebody else's map. Even where the truce held, officers and commanders understood the danger immediately, and not the danger you would hope they noticed. For command, the danger was not that men might die. That was already the schedule. The danger was that men might stop believing the enemy was a monster, which is terrible for morale if your entire business model requires monsters. British General Horace Smith-Dorrien had already warned against friendly contact with the enemy, fearing soldiers might slide into a live-and-let-live view of life. Imagine being so close to peace that your commander has to write a memo telling you not to become reasonable. But command memos could not erase what happened in the frost. Songs, handshakes, shared food, improvised football, and men looking at each other without rifle sights in the way. By Christmas night, Boxing Day, or in a few sectors even near New Year's, the strange pause began to close. Shots returned, orders hardened, and the same no-man's land that had held carols and cigarettes went back to being a place measured in risk. The war grew worse after 1914, with deeper hatred, stricter orders, and weapons that left less room for sentiment to survive. Christmas truces happened again in smaller ways, but never again on the same scale, because the war learned from its own accidental mercy. The soldiers learned too, and many carried the memory not as proof that war was gentle, but as proof that men had briefly refused to become only war. A century later, the Christmas truce survives, because it is not a fairy tale about kindness winning. It is a documented interruption, a crack in the machinery. And that is what makes it oddly human. For one frozen Christmas, the people ordered to be enemies remembered they were people, and the whole war had to stand there awkwardly while humanity refused to follow orders.